Hello everyone, I'm Scarlette Electra, as you've heard, and today we're going to be exploring some eerie tales of wells and springs. As well as looking at some of the darker folklore of real holy wells and springs across Britain, we will also delve into some 20th century ghost stories by writers inspired by the history of these sites. There is a content warning for this talk, as I will be discussing some historical cases of violence against children and disabled people. So before we begin, I wanted to share a little bit about my wider research. I'm currently working on an interdisciplinary PhD in water cultures at the University of Hull in the UK. My project examines the literary and cultural legacies of holy wells and springs in Britain. This explores fictional and non-fictional accounts of wells from a variety of different sources, some of which are listed on the screen, and includes ghost stories. I also consider the management and curation of holy wells by heritage organisations and volunteer groups, and how offerings removed from holy wells are cared for in museum collections. We won't be touching on those last two elements that much in this talk, but I just thought I'd give some colour. So, taking a step back, what actually is a holy well? While different people will have their own definitions, for the purposes of my research, holy wells are springs or pools of water that are considered sacred. This is frequently because of a history as a site of healing, but that's not always the case. Some are used for divination, some are used for cursing. In the Christian tradition, they're often associated with a particular saint, though some sites do have longer histories of use. Holy wells can be found in the hundreds across Britain, but the term itself can encompass a wide range of different locations. Some wells, like St Anthony's on the screen right now, have built elements like a well chapel that covers the spring itself and a pool, so this one's large enough to swim in, but some are much smaller. Other wells, so still given the name well, appear more like springs or little streams and have no built elements or sort of evidence of long use when you're viewing the site. The historian Alexandra Walsham has described the landscape surrounding us as a porous surface upon which each generation inscribes its own attitudes and values without ever being able entirely to erase those of the preceding one. Similarly, the folklorist Kerry Holbrook has defined landscape as consisting of layers of meaning and memory created and built upon by the generations of people who have lived and moved within it. Both models thus attempt to synthesize physical, material understandings of landscape with culturally constructed conceptions of it. Analysing holy wells requires embracing definitions like Holbrook's and Walsham's, as they're both real geographical features and culturally constructed spiritually significant ones, with fairy tale associations for many visitors. While some researchers are devoted to unearthing the real history of holy wells, my research is more concerned with understanding what the folklorist Jeremy Hart has called the myth of the holy well. Hart describes this myth as the compelling, evocative story, which sounds entirely convincing, that all holy wells derive from a single ancient tradition, and have thus flowed to us unchanged from some elemental otherworld. Although holy wells do possess real site-specific histories, many visitors believe them all to be survivals from a pagan past. In 2004, Veronica Strang's ethnographic research, conducted along the River Stour in Dorset, found that popular narratives of Celtic well worship and biblical ideas about living water were as meaningful to many of her informants as scientific deconstructions of H2O and its ecological significance. While scholars like Hart and Jeremy Ratchew have worked to show that holy wells are not just survivals from some mysterious antiquity, in the popular imagination it seems that every British well or spring has ancient pre-Christian origins. Fictional stories of wells and springs can help cement these associations, influencing how visitors engage with these sites in real life. The complicated nature of holy wells is explored in John Francis Campbell's Popular Tales of the West Highlands, which was published from 1860 to 1862. Campbell writes that wells are indicated as mysterious in a great many tales, poison wells and healing wells, and some are still frequented with a half-belief in their virtue. This quote establishes the duality of wells as part of the realm of tales, with an implied fictionality, and as real locations that can actually be frequented. Campbell further emphasises this duality in his chapter exploring the tale of the queen who sought a drink from a certain well, a Scottish version of The Princess and the Frog. The story features a well whose waters can heal the sick and also acts as the home for a cursed talking frog, actually a prince. After telling the tale in both Scottish Gaelic and English, Campbell introduces his readers to the idea that holy healing wells are common all over the Highlands, and that people still leave offerings of pins and nails and bits of rag. He then discusses various accounts of holy wells, including one he visits himself. Wells therefore resist simple categorization as either the stuff of fairy tales or an active part of enduring belief. Instead, for Campbell at least, they exist on the borders between the two. Campbell's quote also identifies the ambivalence of wells in fiction and in real belief systems. They are spaces with the capacity for good and evil, able to both poison and heal. Wirt Sykes, in his 1880 book on Welsh folklore, makes a similar observation, writing that in every corner of Cambria may be found wells of varying power and disposition. Some are healing wells, others are cursing wells, still others combine the power alike to curse and to cure. Across this talk, we will become acquainted with all three types. The first stop on our well journey is a healing well, Munlochy Clootie Well in northern Scotland, not far from Inverness. The well is located in a wood near the small village of Munlochy and is managed by the governmental organisation Forestry and Land Scotland. Like other holy wells and ancient monuments in the region, the well is popular amongst tourists, practitioners of contemporary witchcraft, and those who fall in between both categories. The site is particularly well known for the many offerings, largely ribbons and rags, tied to the trees surrounding the spring, which makes it one of the most famous Clootie wells in Britain. Clootie wells, as they're known in Scotland, or rag wells, as they're called in England and Wales, can be identified by the presence of small strips of cloth tied to trees that grow close to the well site. These trees are then referred to as clootie trees or rag trees. While different types of votive offering have been found at wells and springs in Britain since at least the Neolithic age, clooties and rags can be differentiated from other offerings because of their specific role in the healing ritual associated with these sites. A basic version of this healing ritual involves an injured or sick person dipping a rag, torn from their own clothing, into the well's water and then tying it onto a nearby tree. The ritual may also require them to drink some of the well's water. Then, as the rag decays, the person's illness will be cured or their injury will heal. Contemporary rag wells often possess a huge range of different offerings, which can be left for other reasons, like in memory of lost loved ones. While certain wells have been used for longer stretches of time, many wells have only recently acquired rag or ribbon offerings. Visitors to these locations may have been inspired by seeing wells where rags were already being left, or by exposure to the idea through reading about it or watching something where they're mentioned. Munlochy Clootie Well is still in active use, as you can see from my photographs taken last September. The well is promoted on tourist sites as a family-friendly place of interest. The Forestry and Land Scotland online guide to the well offers a basic outline of how to practice the ritual, while stressing the importance of only ever using biodegradable material for rags that are left there. However, neither their webpage nor the on-site information board mentions the more morbid elements of the well's history. This too has been left out from the well's frequent television appearances from 2009 to 2021 on CBBC, BBC Two, Channel 5, and most recently on Channel 4's Miriam and Alan Lost in Scotland, starring Miriam Margolyes and Alan Cumming. The earliest written accounts of Munlochy Clootie Well appear in Walter Macfarlane's Geographical Collections Related to Scotland, which is composed of material gathered from 1748 to 1749. Here, Macfarlane includes his first-hand observations from the well and information he received from a local tenant. After describing the site as remarkable, Macfarlane shares that he was motivated to visit the well because it was used to banish changelings. According to European folk tradition, changelings are the creatures left behind by fairies or similar beings after they steal a human infant. In changeling folk tales, parents believe that their own child has been replaced with a changeling who looks and behaves differently to the original child. This changeling is typically either an elderly fairy or an ill-thriving fairy infant. The narrative usually progresses with parents performing changeling trials, activities to make the changeling admit its fairy nature. These trials often start tame before escalating into explicit violence, and may successfully result in the original child being returned. Often, however, they just lead to the changeling being banished. As well as featuring in many folk tales, changelings have been an active part of many belief systems. In 1532, to give just one example, Martin Luther advised a German prince to drown a 12-year-old child judged to be a changeling in a nearby river. He didn't consider this action to be a homicide, since he thought the child was without a soul. Thankfully, the prince did not follow his advice. In his book, Macfarlane describes how Manlocky Clwtywell tied into local changeling beliefs. He writes that when children happen to be sick and languish long in their malady, so that they almost turn skeletons, the common people imagine they are taken away, at least the substance, by spirits called fairies, with only the shadow left with their original families. In response, their parents would travel to Manlocky Clwtywell and leave them all night near the well to either end them or mend them, and they say many more do recover than do not. One of Macfarlane's local interviewees told him that the well even recovered some who were 8 or 9 years of age, so we're not just talking about small infants here. Recovered can be read as having a double meaning. The well has recovered children that had been stolen from their new home in fairyland, as well as helped them recover, implying changelinghood is more like a normal disease, which the well can heal. In his book Fairies: A Dangerous History, Richard Sugg identifies that exposure near water, or immersion in it, was one of many trials that suspected changeling children were put through, with them also often being beaten or burnt. Macfarlane's interviewee also tells him that more unusually, the well was used to treat adults suspected to be changelings. He recounts that in the middle of the night at the well, he once found a man who had been long sick, swaddled in cloth, and tied to a stake stuck in the ground so that he could scarcely move. While he did free him, the man unfortunately did not recover. While Macfarlane records that when children were left at the well, their parents would remain nearby, watching at a distance. This man seems to have been entirely alone, restrained and unsympathetically exposed to the elements because of his sickness, which could be a physical illness or mental illness. To place this practice within a wider context, several other examples of real-world violence towards those suspected to be changelings were recorded up until the late 19th century. These include several cases where individuals claimed immersion in water was used in the hope of tempting fairies to re-exchange their children. In 1826, in Kerry Island, Michael Leahy, a 4-year-old boy who couldn't walk or speak, was believed to be a changeling. He was drowned after being held for too long in the waters of the River Flesk to cure his fairy sickness. On the Isle of Skye in 1862, Arthur Mitchell, an antiquarian and physician, recorded another response to changelings. Parents had to place the changeling on the beach by the waterside when the tide is out and pay no attention to its screams. He continues that the fairies, rather than suffer their own to be drowned by the rising water, spirit it away and restore the child they had stolen. Parents were to know and trust their own child had been returned by the cessation of the child's crying. Sugg has described how part of the logic of the ill treatment of changelings was the sense that fairies cared enough about their offspring to rescue them from such abuses. An 1878 account, published in the Celtic magazine, described how a woman from the Inner Hebrides left the child she believed was a changeling upon the shore, so it might be taken away by the fairies and her own infant restored. However, when the fairies failed to take the changeling, or apparent changeling, after several hours, she took it back. Perhaps she didn't have the stomach to wait until the crying had ceased, knowing that, like at Manlocky Clwtywell, this too was really a case of ending or mending. Several scholars, like Susan Schoon-Eberly, have interpreted violence against changelings as a socially countenanced form of infanticide, allowing parents to abandon a disabled or chronically ill child who they found it difficult to care for. Changeling narratives involving wells have also been adapted and interrogated by multiple contemporary novelists. Katarina Monroe's 2023 horror thriller novel, Graveyard of Lost Children, uses watery changeling lore to interrogate postpartum psychosis and the isolation faced by new mothers. In the novel, multiple generations of mothers find themselves enchanted and haunted by the idea of drowning their children in a well. Elsewhere, Neil Jordan's 2023 contemporary fiction novel, The Well of St. Nobody, experiments with the idea that wells can banish changelings. In the novel, a mother pushes the able-bodied imposter pretending to be her son down a well and embraces and welcomes home her real disabled son. Water was not unanimously effective as a changeling repellent. While Monoki Clutywell may have had some success in recovering children, parents who visited other wells for the same reason were sometimes less fortunate. St Uni's Holy Well, also known as Chapel Uni Well in West Cornwall, appears in folk tales as a site with a reputation for getting rid of changelings, but ultimately proves unsuccessful. This well features in a folktale collected by both Robert Hunt in 1864 and William Bottrell in 1873, recorded under the names The Spriggan's Child and The Changeling of Braveen. Both versions recount the ordeals of Janie, or Jenny, a woman whose child has been replaced by a changeling. Her neighbours instruct her to bathe the changeling in St Uni's Holy Well at dawn on the 3 first Wednesdays in flowery May. She listens to their advice and makes the mile-long journey to the well to plunge the child. Her efforts are sadly in vain, as the changeling enjoys the trip. He finds being bathed in the well rare play, roaring aloud for fun. One day, when walking to the well, she hears a disembodied voice greeting the changeling and mentioning his wife and children. To her absolute horror, the child she is carrying replies in the voice of a grown man, saying that he cares little about his fairy family, since he's being fed and cared for to his heart's content by Janie. Following this unnatural experience, she turns to more violent solutions, which do result in her original human son being returned. Both Hunt and Bottrell record that as of their time of writing, the well was still used on the first 3 Wednesdays in May. Hunt identifies the well as assisting with mesenteric diseases, while Bottrell claims that it was used to cure most diseases incidental to childhood. Neither writer, however, suggests that the well's continued use was still linked to changeling belief. When I visited the well last March, the site was covered in all manner of offerings, indicating its popularity even today. Hunt and Bottrell record several other Cornish holy wells as aiding with childhood ailments, like skin diseases when infants are immersed in the water. Even more examples of wells being used to cure children can be found in the 1894 book, Ancient and Holy Wells of Cornwall. This book was the joint effort of Mabel and Lillian Quiller-Couch to publish their father Thomas's manuscript notes on Cornish holy wells. It features wells with the ability to help children with congenital conditions, rickets, and whooping cough. Jesus Well in St Minver, which they discuss, that is the whooping cough curing well, was drawn and described by Thomas. He wrote that it stood on a bleak high down, with the small building covering its water, often half buried with the drifted sea sand from the beaches near. While an 1879 book describes the well as dry, the spring having been intercepted by a new landowner, by the 1890s, when Mabel and Lillian visited, this was no longer the case. The water was freely flowing once more. Mabel and Lillian learned from local residents that the well Mabel and Lillian learned from local residents that the well was still used for healing, and that children suffering from whooping cough were taken to the well to drink from it. An elderly man then informed them that he remembered when children were dipped in the well to cure their whooping cough. It is this older practice which captured Mabel's imagination even a few years after publishing Ancient and Holy Wells of Cornwall. In 1897, she released Some Western Folk, a collection including the short story A Faith Cure. This imagines the potential negative consequences of using a holy well to bathe a weak or ill child. Mabel was slightly inspired by the idea of unsuccessful healings which didn't make the historical record. In the story, Martha is persuaded by her sister-in-law Liza to travel to an unnamed holy well at dawn to heal her son Herbert's whooping cough. Drinking the water healed Liza's daughter, Polly, some years earlier, and while Martha fears how the cold journey will affect Herbert's delicate chest, she takes the risk. Polly only drank the water when she had whooping cough, but they decide Herbert needs to be dipped since he's coughing too much to swallow. When Liza does so, plunging him 3 times into the cold water, he does not survive. While I haven't found any 19th century accounts of real drownings at Cornish holy wells, it's not unlikely that Mabel took inspiration from Michael Leahy's death by drowning. Even though she wasn't born until several years after his death, newspaper reports of the case were quoted in Thomas Crofton Croker's influential 1828 book, Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland. In his autobiography, Mabel's brother, Arthur, described how as children he and his sisters had a run of their father's library, rich beyond common in poetry, romantic tales, and folklore. It's very likely that a copy of Crofton Croker's book would have been in Thomas Quillicucci's collection. Another Irish case was nearly contemporary to Mabel's time of writing, although it's very unlikely that she would have encountered it, since it did not make the press outside of Ireland. In 1891, a 27-year-old man travelled to St Bridget's Well in County Clare to cure his paralysis, but slipped, fell headfirst into the well, and drowned. These early folklore collectors, like Hunt, Bottrell, and the Quillicuccis, quickly established that the archetypal holy well is one in ruins. They repeatedly ruminate on the tragic nature of this process, with one of their key motivations for writing clearly being the preservation of these spaces and the stories surrounding them, before they become permanently inaccessible. This is particularly felt across Robert Charles Hope's 1893 book, The Legendary Lore of the Holy Wells of England, where almost every well mentioned is in poor condition. Many wells are described as unsightly, overgrown, and ruinous, or worn by age, and several more are recorded as built over, destroyed, or disappeared. Alongside these observations, Hope emphasises people's diminished belief in the efficacy and sacredness of the well water. Wells are repeatedly referred to as now unknown or forgotten. Fear was a huge motivator for early folklore collectors. As Owen Davies and Kerry Holbrook have written, this sense of an ancient rural culture slipping away fueled the urge to record folklore during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was an urgency to the task, since they felt as if those who knew about folk traditions were passing away without passing on their knowledge, leading to it being lost forever. Bottrell's source for information about one Cornish ragwell, Madron Well, was an elderly dame, who herself tells him about an old dame called Anne Catty, who 50 years earlier used to direct folks how they were to proceed in using the water. He thus emphasises that knowledge related to holy wells belongs primarily to previous, perhaps lost, generations, emphasising he and his contemporary collectors' distances from a time when these spaces were regularly used. This also emphasises the importance of the information that they do gather. When Bottrell tries to inquire as to why certain behaviour was part of the Madron Well ritual, the woman cannot provide him with any explanations. She only answers with, "Such were the old customs which everyone knew." While everyone might once have known, Bottrell makes the point that a lack of written record now means that no one does. This is an anxiety we can see influencing all 3 of the 20th century ghost stories we'll now look at. Although they vary in tone and can be said to have different aims, such as to be entertaining or to moralise, they are united by a sense that our knowledge of holy wells and the supernatural will soon be gone. In these tales, rather than modernity leading to an increase in humanity's understanding of the world around them, it results in the loss of truths we once completely understood. In each story, our protagonists are unaware of how to proceed when encountering strange wells which operate by unfamiliar rules. It is only with help from others that they are able to proceed, and even then, they are often unprepared for the consequences of interacting with these landscapes. E.F. Benson's The Wishing Well, written in 1929, is set in Cornwall, though it does not seem to have been inspired by a particular Cornish well. It's more a composite of a few different sites. It takes place in the fictional village of St Gervais in North Cornwall. Even before supernatural events begin to take place, the village is emphasised as possessing a strange temporality due to its isolation. Benson describes how the world takes very little heed of St. Gervais, and Gervais hardly more of the outer world. Buses are mentioned, but only in the context of them seldom stopping to either drop off or pick up anyone. There is a temporal stasis implied by the village's disconnect from the modern world, and rather than moving linearly, time might be described as frozen. This aligns with earlier cultural assumptions about Cornwall. In 1851, Wilkie Collins published his travelogue exploring the county under the title Rambles Beyond Railways. Collins emphasises the region's geographical isolation from the rest of the country, a reputation which has continued into the 21st century. Ruth Herholt and Tanya Shavinska, in their Gothic Kerno, Cornwall, A Strange Fiction, have suggested that touristic and fictional imaginings of Cornwall have successfully categorised it as a space where the landscape itself is strange, animated, and alive in its ungraspable otherness. Our protagonist in this story is Judith, the middle-aged daughter of the village's reverend, who is a foremost authority on folklore. He spends most of his time in his library, working on his book on the history of witchcraft. Judith, by contrast, has fostered a close relationship with the parishioners, and is thus aware of something her intellectual father is not: that the village's tradition of spells and superstition of a darker sort does not only exist in the past. The Reverend dictates to her about the tradition of satanic wishing wells, which used to be used to invoke evil, labelling the well in St. Gervais as the most perfectly preserved of these sites. He further claims that though the local belief in the village wishing well has survived, its power is now never used for evil purposes. Instead, he lists its benevolent uses, such as to protect pregnant women or men who have gone to sea. Judith, however, knows better, aware that the well is not as far removed from its satanic origins as her father thinks. Until her recent death, a local woman, Sally, frequently used the well to curse those who crossed her, and was thus universally held to be a witch. A contrast is thus created between the two methods of folklore acquisition practiced by Judith and her father. To him, time linearly progresses away from a pagan spirituality and towards Christianity. Folk traditions are thus made harmless, entertaining, and intellectually stimulating. Meanwhile, Judith understands such beliefs firsthand, having had information about Sally's witchness whispered to her over the knitting needles. Judith then visits Mrs. Penarth, a local woman, who tells her more about the well's uses in her youth. She tells Judith that maids would tell an old crone like Sally if she fancied a young man, and then the old woman would recite some gabble while the maid drank the water. Although the reasons for this aren't provided, we can assume this is some sort of love spell. Several Cornish holy wells were used for divination related to love and marriage. At Madronwell, Bottrell learned that once scores of maidens would travel to the well to try for sweethearts by dropping in pins. If the pins remained together as they sunk, the couple would also. The Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford currently holds several pins retrieved from this well, collected in 1887 and 1895. Mrs. Penarth also shares that the St. Gervais wishing well could be used to curse one's enemies. To curse someone, their name needed to be written on some paper and then hidden in the well's stonework. This would lead to them experiencing a range of tribulations. His cows would go dry, or his boat would be wrecked, or his children get deadly dwams, or his wife break her marriage vows, or he himself would pine and fail till he was scarce able to put foot to floor. Mrs. Penarth's account further clarifies the differences between Judith and her father's experiences. Judith continues to gain new knowledge about these spaces, which her father assumes has died out and which he cannot access. While he pursues his academic researches into the world of things occult and terrible, Judith is now entering a world where they are very real, with the power over life and death. As Benson writes, the doors were swinging open to admit her in very truth. Judith then visits the wishing well and encounters Sally's ghost, from which she initially flees. Nevertheless, over time, her fascination with the well increases, and she initially hopes it can offer her the help of a friendly power to obtain the love of Stephen, Mrs. Penarth's son. However, upon learning that he plans to marry another and mocks her interest in him, She instead wishes sickness and death on him. She hides a slip of paper with his name in a fern-fringed niche in the wall and pledges herself to the master of evil. She then cements her transformation into a witch figure by kissing the rotting ghost of Sally. She feels the frayed lips fretted with decay melt into her until she is left clasping the empty air, as if something in Sally has now possessed her. Soon after, Stephen rapidly declines with a burning fever that consumes the flesh on his bones. Despite Judith's initial happiness, such entanglements with the well are not harmless. Mrs. Penarth then uses it to seek revenge, leading to Judith herself becoming ill. Having been seduced by the power that the well seemed to promise, Judith pays the final price for her meddling. Shepherded by Mrs. Penarth, she falls into the well and drowns, literally consumed by its waters. The next ghost story we're going to look at is Sabine Baring-Gould's The White Flag, which is about St Elian's Well in Wales and was published in 1904. Like Mabel Quillicucci's short story, Baring-Gould was influenced by his academic, non-fiction writing about a holy well. His story is thus steeped in the existing lore and history of a real site, which he'd written about in his 1903 A Book of North Wales. There, Baring-Gould describes St Elian's Well and its history as a cursing well, used against one's adversaries. According to him, since time immemorial, a guardian of the well would minister to the resentments of the ill-disposed. Baring-Gould was not the first fiction writer inspired by the site. In 1814, Charlotte Wardle, aged 17, published a long poem called St Elian's or the Cursing Well, where a knight enlists a witch's help to curse another knight. Her book closes with a description of the real site, its location, and its historic uses. Another fictional tale of the well was serialised by Gomer Williams for the Cardiff Times from 1895 to 1896. This story, called Blodwyn Rhys, A Story of the Cursing Well, differs significantly from Wardle and Baring-Gould's imaginative accounts, since nothing supernatural actually takes place. Instead, Hopkin, who travels to the well to use it against both his love rival and his own father, is tricked by the priest of the well. The priest gets an accomplice to play the part of the spirit of St Elian, fooling Hopkin entirely and persuading him to pay even more money for the curses. Baring-Gould was familiar with Wardle's poem, quoting from her non-fiction account in his book. At the end of her book, she details how an old woman, who served as guardian or priest of the well, would be paid to write someone's name on a piece of lead and then drop it inside. In order to have the curse removed, the cursed individual would have to pay the guardian double to remove their name from the water. Baring-Gould's book records that the last guardian of the well, John Evans, only died in 1858. A slightly different ritual for the same site is described in Wirt Sykes's book, where a pin and a pebble inscribed with the initials of your enemy must be cast in for an effective curse. Sykes calls St Elian's the most dreadful well in Wales, and notes that death has in many instances resulted from the curse of this wickedly malicious well. As of Baring-Gould's time of writing, the well had become such an occasion for ill feeling that a former incumbent of the parish had the well filled up, and the built structure over it destroyed. Baring-Gould's The White Flag begins very far away from a remote Welsh well in South Africa and is set during the Second Boer War. If you aren't familiar with the tale and are going to read it after this, I do want to just mention that Baring-Gould uses very insensitive language to discuss the treatment of imprisoned Boers by the British, so it's something to keep in mind. We first meet Jacob van Heeren, a South African Boer man who deliberately waves a white flag over his farmhouse, pretending to surrender in order to lure over British troops. When they do approach, he and his sons kill them. In one instance, he even pretends to be wounded, lying on the ground while waving a white handkerchief. When a young British soldier approaches, he shoots him in the heart. This soldier, Aneurin, was the only son of Winifred, a widow from North Wales, who is devastated to learn of her son's passing. After she finds out how he was killed, her anguish turns to rage. Baring Gould writes that if Winifred had known the name of the man who had killed her son, she would have gone out to South Africa and stabbed him herself. Winifred, desperate to find a way to punish her son's killer, suddenly remembers hearing of St Elian's cursing well. In A Book of North Wales, Baring Gould records that in 1818, the priest of the well at the time was jailed for a year for obtaining money under false pretenses by being paid to put names in the well and then remove them. It is this incident which he fictionalises and Winifred remembers, alongside where the priest of the well's granddaughter lives. Knowing that the local parson had done what lay in his power to destroy it and blot out any remembrance of the powers of the well, Winifred fears it may no longer be effective. Nevertheless, she wonders if anyone could really have stopped the still-flowing spring of its virtues. The built structure may no longer exist, but the water still flows. Information about the well is increasingly scarce for Winifred to find, and she is unfamiliar with how to curse someone. Just like Judith had to turn to Mrs. Penarth, Winifred must track down the false priest's granddaughter, now an old woman herself, to learn of the well's ritual. This woman, when Winifred finds her, is very shy and very unwilling to share her knowledge of the well, as she's scared of punishment from the same magistrates who imprisoned her grandfather. It's only Winifred's vehemence in prosecuting her inquiries and paying her a sovereign that tempts her to overcome these scruples. Baring Gould was likely speaking from experience about the reluctancy of many people to share their folk beliefs. He collected Cornish and Devonshire folk songs and authored several collections on the folklore of different regions. Other folklorists and antiquarians have expressed similar difficulties. In his Popular Tales of the West Highlands, Campbell writes that few would confess that they still leave offerings at wells. Mitchell, the doctor who earlier informed us about changeling beliefs on the Isle of Skye, also expressed similar thoughts in his 1880 book, The Past in the Present, What is Civilization? Mitchell wrote that there's a difficulty in getting people to confess to their visits to wells, and, of course, a greater difficulty still in getting them to speak freely and frankly about the feelings and beliefs which led to them. Eventually, the granddaughter provides Winifred with two possible rituals. The first closely resembles that described by Sykes. She's told she must drop a pebble inscribed with the killer's name into the well. However, since she doesn't know the killer's name, a different ritual is proposed, where she instead calls out her son's name. While she does so, she must drop pebbles continuously into the well until the spring boils up black as ink. Winifred performs this, and after 17 stones are dropped in the well, it responds just like the woman said it would. In South Africa, this summons Aneirin's ghost, who begins to terrorise his killer Jacob. Over a few days, Jacob watches as the white flag he used to lure Aneirin is tied higher and higher up his left leg, rendering the limb increasingly paralysed. The rest of his family can't see this happening, even as the ghost progresses to his right leg and then all over his body. Finally, he's touched on the heart with the white flag and dies. Meanwhile, since it's been 7 days since her visit to the well, Winifred begins to doubt the curse's effectiveness. She queries whether there was any truth to the ritual, and wonders if she just had a falling in with an old superstition that had died out with the advance of knowledge and under the influence of wholesome feelings. Her doubt is quickly assuaged when the ghost of her son then appears to her. By saying his name as she threw in the pebble, she summoned him from the world of spirits to kill Jacob. Aneirin then shows her a vision of his future had he not been killed young. It begins with a tale of dishonour, disgust and scandal in the divorce court, then his vice for gambling, followed by his suicide. The ghost tells her that if he had not died young, fresh and innocent, he would have lived a life of infamy. She should thus thank rather than curse Jacob. Finally, he tells her he must lay the white flag over her head and kill her, since she claimed to exercise vengeance herself instead of leaving it to God. As in Benson's tale, the woman who tried to use a well for evil ends falls victim to the same powerful forces she attempted to wield. The two stories have other similarities, with both Judith and Winifred using cursing wells to seek revenge against the men who've wronged them, despite their fragmentary understanding of the well's limitations and abilities. The The women's lack of personal connection to the wells and limited understanding of the forces they're dabbling with places them at risk. If Winifred was better informed about St. Elian's well, instead of relying on a rather distant source of information, the priest's granddaughter, she may have understood using the well could bring about her own demise. Similarly, if Judith had not been divided by Mrs. Pennoth by class and was more situated within the village itself, she may have had greater respect for her expertise and thought twice about using the well, especially since it was Mrs. Pennoth who taught her how to do so. In both Benson and Baring Gould's narratives, traditional spiritual knowledge is depicted as quickly fading from modern society, soon to be permanently lost. There are, however, still ways of finding this knowledge. While they may not be easy and can have dangerous consequences, both Judith and Winifred are able to find out the information they seek. In our next tale, M.R. James interrogates one of the reasons why this knowledge is being lost. Wailing Well, published in 1928, explores younger generations' decreasing trust in and respect for traditional knowledge. An increased disconnect between people and place is visible across much of the fiction and non-fiction looking at holy wells. The story focuses on three scouts, Stanley, Wilfrid, and Algernon, who are outsiders to the Dorsetshire landscape they're camping in. Stanley, who James tells us was almost kicked out of the Scouts for his poor behaviour and recklessness, becomes curious about a strange clump in a field, which he likes the look of. When the other boys tell him that since the field is inside the red ring on their maps, they aren't allowed to go, he tells them that he doesn't care. They then ask a local shepherd about the field, who tells them it contains the Wailing Well and warns them to stay away from it. Even when the shepherd informs them that no one in these parts uses Wailing Well, nor haven't done in all the years I've lived here, Stanley boasts that today he will be the one to break that record. Stanley's stubbornness leads the man to admit the reason why no one will venture into the field. He informs them that it's haunted by 3 women and a man, all of whom died before his time, but was all bad uns when they was alive. This could explain why the field appeals so much to Stanley. Stanley's dismissive of his advice and responds scornfully, "Why, you don't mean they're deaders. You must be a lot of fools to believe that." He remains undeterred even after the shepherd claims entering the field would cause Stanley's death. He even doesn't care about the ominous first-hand account of the creatures the shepherd provides. The shepherd has watched them wander round the field, rags and bones, all 4 of them, fluttering rags and whitey bones. They hadn't much to call faces, but I could seem to see as they had teeth. In response, Stanley rejects the shepherd's testimony, reasserts his aim to go to the well the next chance he gets, and accuses him of hiding a whiskey still in the field. Wailing Well thus situates itself within a world of declining belief in the supernatural. Although the Scout leaders don't necessarily believe or understand local belief in the Wailing Well, they still mark the maps, listen to the locals, and tell the Scouts to stay away from the field. Stanley, disregarding all authority figures, sneaks off to the well, resolving to draw water from it with a can and some rope. When the other boys and one of the Scout leaders realise he's missing, they follow him, but can only watch uselessly from a distance as he's stalked and caught by 4 ghoulish figures. The creatures then use his own rope to hang him from a tree in the field. His body, when cut down, is completely drained of blood, but his ghost remains in the field forever. James finishes by writing, "The present population of the Wailing Well field consists of 3 women, a man, and a boy." Stanley is left vulnerable to these supernatural forces because of his unwillingness to treat traditional knowledge as valuable. He therefore has no way of resisting when he's assimilated into the world of these beliefs. Following Stanley's murder, one of the Scout leaders tries to cut or burn down all the trees in the field. He returns defeated with a nasty cut in his leg and a broken axe helve, since not a spark of fire could he light, and on no single tree could he make the least impression. The entire landscape surrounding Wailing Well, even down to its flora, possesses a supernatural agency and can resist destruction. The idea that wells can protect themselves when at risk of annihilation or disrespect rears its head in several tales. Wells sometimes move when they've been polluted, such as if animals or dirty clothes are washed in them. In one Cornish folk tale, collected by Thomas Quillicooch, about St Nun's Well, a farmer who tried to drag away the font of a holy well is struck lame and speechless in response to trying to drag it. Hunt also records an anecdote from his friend that only a few weeks since, an old man told me that a person who altered an old holy well there was drowned the next day in very sight of his home. In this talk, I've tried to offer just a small drop of the Eerie traditions surrounding wells and springs, and show how they have served as inspirations for writers across the centuries. Looking at both the folklore and fiction associated with these sites lets us see the many ways that they've been revered, feared, and reinterpreted over time. Although, as we've seen, folklorists have long mourned the decline and ruin of these spaces, many wells remain active, thriving sites of spiritual expression or popular tourist locations. And while the ways that people engage with them may change, they continue to be important sites of cultural connection. In 2020, two ghost hunters with a following of over 2 million on a popular social media platform visited Munlochy Clootie Well. They captured a photograph they believed resembled a witch or the ghost of a witch, showing how these spaces continue to capture the imagination and acquire new narrative layers as time goes by. And here is my bibliography. Thank you so much for coming.